This is the entire Second World War as America lived it. Not a tour of European maps, but of US choices. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. While Germany rearmed behind clever bookkeeping and shadow budgets, most Americans were busy with the aftermath of the Great Depression. They called it a European storm. They stayed out. But the storm kept drifting west. By 1939, Blitzkrieg smashed Poland, and in 1940, France fell in 6 weeks. The news reached American shores. Washington began the pivot. Cash and carry, then destroyers for bases, then Lend-Lease. Quiet steps toward becoming the arsenal of democracy. December 7th, 1941. On a Sunday morning, Pearl Harbor is attacked. In one stroke, isolation ends. America declares a two-ocean war, Germany first, Japan to the finish. Midway flips the Pacific. D-Day opens France. The Bulge fails to break US forces. By 1945, the Nazi regime has fallen, and the war is over. This is the story of how a country that wanted no part of the fight became the fulcrum of victory. In the US, the first reaction was distance. American newspapers in January 1933 treated Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany as a secondary item, often placing it on the inside pages. That editorial choice reflected a broad assumption. Europe's political turmoil could be monitored, not managed. The memory of World War I's cost in lives and national treasure had hardened into a durable isolationism. Many Americans were determined to avoid repeating what they saw as a tragic mistake. This public mood found a powerful voice in the investigations of the Nye Committee. Senator Gerald Nye's panel examined the munitions industry and asked whether arms manufacturers had profited from and influenced America's entry into the last war. The suggestion that financial interests could override the national interest deepened public skepticism. For many, foreign entanglements looked like profit for a few and peril for the many. The prevailing view among voters and many leaders held that Hitler was another surge of European extremism that would moderate with time. He was seen as a radical, but not necessarily a unique or enduring threat. That judgment underestimated the ideological fanaticism and the expansionist ambitions driving the Nazi regime. It misread both the man and the movement. Inside the State Department, reports from diplomats in Germany described the consolidation of power, repression of political opposition, early persecution of Jews, and aggressive rhetoric. Yet these warnings competed with the national mood and did not shape public debate. The machinery of democratic scrutiny ran on incomplete information and cautious politics. The Great Depression dominated daily life. Unemployment remained high. Millions were still out of work as the decade wore on, and economic hardship was everywhere. Recovery programs demanded attention and resources. For families trying to secure a paycheck and a meal, events in Europe seemed abstract. The country's gaze was fixed on breadlines and bank failures, not on a foreign leader's ascent. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the risks posed by Japan, Italy, and Germany, but his room to maneuver was narrow. Isolationist sentiment in Congress was strong and organized. Working within those limits, he prioritized domestic recovery and accepted legislation designed to keep the United States out of foreign conflicts. The Neutrality Acts codified the desire to avoid entanglement and constrained rapid responses to threats abroad. These forces reinforced each other. A press that downplayed the initial alarm, a public shaped by the trauma of the previous war, a Congress determined to wall off foreign crises, and an economic emergency that demanded every available resource. Together, they produced a national posture of watchfulness without readiness. The assumption was that storms abroad would lose energy before making landfall. But the storm gathered strength. Reports of aggressive moves abroad trickled into Washington and were assessed against a backdrop of caution at home. The distance felt safe. It was not. While America focused on recovery and restraint, events in Europe moved on their own timeline, under their own logic. Out of sight, new methods and new financing would change the balance of power. The next development did not advertise itself with speeches or parades. It lived in ledgers and contracts, and it grew quietly. While America remained focused on its domestic recovery, Germany engineered a sophisticated mechanism to rebuild its military might in secret. The system relied on Mefo bills, a form of promissory note named after the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, a dummy corporation created for this purpose. These bills functioned as instruments of state credit issued to arms manufacturers like Krupp and Rheinmetall in payment for military goods. Companies could hold the bills to maturity or sell them to other German banks, which would rediscount them with the Reichsbank. The result was a controlled circuit of credit that financed rearmament without appearing in the official national budget. The Versailles Treaty had imposed severe restrictions on German military spending and capabilities. The Mefo bill system was designed to circumvent these limits. By keeping enormous expenditures for tanks, aircraft, and artillery off the public ledger, the Nazi regime could present fiscal discipline while constructing a modern war machine. The scale was large and sustained. In the mid-1930s, Mefo bills underwrote a significant share of rearmament outlays, amounting to billions of Reichsmarks. This deception was the economic backbone of Hitler's military ambitions, enabling a pace of expansion unlikely under transparent accounting. This was not improvisation, it was policy. Publicly, the regime showcased projects like Autobahn construction and headline unemployment figures to signal recovery. Internally, Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, coordinated a parallel structure of credit and contracts. His financial design created a shadow economy dedicated to war preparation. The assumption was stark. The bills would be redeemed once strategic objectives delivered the resources to pay for them. It was a wager on conquest. The machinery was simple and relentless. Mefo bills deferred cash payments, pushed liabilities forward, and concentrated capacity in heavy industry. They also masked inflationary pressures that would have exposed the scale of rearmament. Suppliers received reliable paper. Banks received rediscountable assets. The Reichsbank provided the backstop. The state fused planning, budgets, and industry into a single pipeline. Foreign observers saw fragments of the result. New factories, growing orders for aluminum and synthetic fuels, a revived aviation sector, but could not readily explain how these expansions avoided obvious fiscal strain. Without visibility into the credit loop, the pieces did not assemble into a full picture. By the late 1930s, the consequences were visible on parade grounds and airfields. The army grew far beyond the 100,000-man ceiling imposed by Versailles, and mobilized into a force numbering in the millions. The Luftwaffe moved from clandestine training to a credible air arm. Doctrine evolved alongside hardware. Rapid combined arms tactics promised operational shock. The groundwork was laid for aggression, not merely deterrence. The Mefo bill system remains a case study in weaponized finance. It hid intent behind routine paperwork and delayed outside reactions. The international community hesitated, measured, and debated while Germany accelerated. The head start that resulted shifted the timing and the terms of the coming confrontation. Across the Atlantic, these developments collided with a legal framework built to prevent entanglement abroad. The United States was about to express caution, not just in rhetoric, but in statute. Congress would write the mood of distance into law. The Neutrality Acts became the instrument. They were designed to keep the United States clear of the next European war. Congress responded to growing tensions by codifying American isolationism into statute. The Neutrality Act of 1935 emerged as the legislative embodiment of the nation's determination to avoid foreign conflicts. It established a mandatory arms embargo against all belligerent nations once a state of war was declared. It warned American citizens that traveling on ships of warring nations was at their own risk, a direct response to incidents that had drawn the United States into the First World War. The legislation reflected a widespread belief that strict non-involvement was the surest guarantee of national security. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the act, but his approval came with private reservations. He recognized that a blanket embargo failed to distinguish between aggressors and their victims. This one-size-fits-all approach assumed a moral equivalence in every conflict, which troubled the administration. Roosevelt understood the political necessity of the law given the powerful isolationist sentiment in Congress, yet he feared its rigidity would handcuff American diplomacy in a crisis. He began searching for ways to assist nations resisting aggression without openly violating the letter of the statute. The limitations of this framework became stark during the Italo-Ethiopian War. When Italy, under Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, the act was invoked. The United States was legally prohibited from selling arms to Ethiopia, a nation trying to defend itself against a modern European army. Ethiopia's appeals for support met sympathy but no relief in Washington, because the law allowed no flexibility. This episode showed how neutrality legislation could inadvertently favor an aggressor with superior military-industrial capacity. Italy had ample arms and production. Ethiopia did not. A policy intended to avoid entanglement skewed the battlefield. Congress reinforced the stance with the Neutrality Act of 1936, which renewed the 1935 provisions and added a ban on loans or credits to belligerents. The following year, the Neutrality Act of 1937 made these measures permanent and introduced the cash and carry clause. Belligerents could purchase certain non-military goods, such as oil and industrial materials, provided they paid immediately and transported the goods on their own ships. Cash and carry was a delicate compromise. It aimed to stimulate the American economy through trade while keeping U.S. ships and sailors out of danger zones. In practice, it favored Great Britain and France because they controlled major sea lanes and possessed merchant fleets. It was a small but significant crack in the wall of absolute neutrality, reflecting Roosevelt's persistent effort to find legal avenues for limited support. The administration framed it as an instrument of peace. Isolationists saw a slope toward involvement. The tension between legal neutrality and moral responsibility became a defining theme of American foreign policy in the late 1930s. Each new act of aggression in Europe and Asia forced a re-evaluation of the statutes. What was meant to prevent entanglement increasingly looked like an obstacle to preserving any semblance of international order. Roosevelt observed the letter of the law in public while probing its edges in practice. He experimented with moral embargoes, urging American firms to avoid selling aircraft to regimes bombing civilians. Voluntary measures without the force of statute but clear in intent. This period revealed a divided government responding to a deteriorating world. The executive branch read the threat and pushed against limits. The legislative branch echoed a public wary of war and reinforced those limits. The Neutrality Acts evolved under pressure, renewed, amended, tested, yet their core logic held. Distance first, caution always. Events would soon test that logic against speed and shock, and force planners to ask whether laws built for a slow-moving crisis could withstand a war that moved by the week. The shock arrived in the East. The Polish campaign made abstract warnings concrete. Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, demonstrated a new kind of warfare that rendered previous military doctrines obsolete. The strategy, known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, integrated air power, armor, and mobile infantry into a single, coordinated instrument of attack. Stuka dive bombers struck communication hubs and rail junctions to paralyze response and sow panic ahead of the advance. Panzer divisions then punched through defensive lines, moving faster than opposing forces could react. Motorized infantry followed to consolidate gains and eliminate pockets of resistance. This integration created a continuous wave of destruction that bypassed strong points and targeted command structures. American military observers, steeped in the experience of the First World War, had anticipated a conflict of static trench warfare. They expected a slow, grinding attritional battle where defenses would hold for months, if not years. The swift collapse of Polish forces in a matter of weeks delivered a profound shock to War Department planners. The Polish army, though valiant, was configured to fight the previous war. Its cavalry brigades were outmatched by German tanks and mechanized units, and its mobilization plans were disrupted by the speed and depth of the German attack. The front disintegrated faster than orders could be issued. The speed of Poland's defeat forced an immediate and fundamental re-evaluation of American military doctrine. The assumption that the United States would have ample time to mobilize its industry and train a massive army after a war began was now in doubt. A future enemy might achieve decisive victory before American power could be brought to bear. War Department planners began an intensive study of German tactics, dissecting every report from the Polish campaign. They analyzed operational tempo, the use of combined arms, and the emphasis on deep penetration rather than frontal assault. This analysis revealed critical deficiencies in the United States Army's own structure and thinking. The American Army was small, poorly equipped with modern weapons, and its training emphasized methods that the Blitzkrieg had just shown to be ineffective. The focus shifted toward developing a more mobile, mechanized force capable of rapid deployment and offensive action. The lessons from Poland directly influenced the creation of new armored divisions and accelerated the development of American tank designs, moving away from infantry support vehicles toward more capable armored platforms. Public opinion polls conducted in the aftermath of the WWII's invasion showed a sharp increase in American concern about European events. While specific figures varied, Gallup's surveys recorded a rising share of Americans who believed aiding those resisting aggression was worth considering, even as a majority still opposed direct entry into the war. The fall of Poland was not a distant, abstract event. It was a concrete demonstration of a fast, coordinated form of aggression. Newspapers and newsreels brought images of the bombing of Warsaw and columns of refugees into American homes, making the threat feel immediate. The comfortable assumption that European wars would be slow, contained affairs evaporated. The weeks it took for Poland to fall set a new benchmark for modern warfare. It showed that technological and doctrinal superiority, air, armor, and mobile infantry acting as one, could deliver a knockout blow with startling speed. This realization began to crack the wall of American isolationism. The debate was no longer solely about whether to avoid war, but about how to prepare for a conflict that might arrive with little warning. Then the front went quiet in the West. As winter approached, observers asked whether the pace would slow or whether the next blow would land elsewhere. The period following the invasion of Poland became known as the Phony War. From September 1939 to April 1940, the Western Front saw little significant military action. This prolonged lull reinforced the arguments of American isolationists. They pointed to the quiet lines as evidence that the European conflict might simply burn itself out without requiring American involvement. The absence of decisive operations allowed many to cling to the hope that the United States could remain a spectator. The illusion collapsed in the spring of 1940. On May 10th, Germany launched its Western offensive with devastating effect. The main thrust did not strike the heavily fortified Maginot Line. It cut through the Ardennes forest, terrain Allied planners had deemed unsuitable for a modern, mechanized army. They believed the dense woods and narrow roads would delay any advance long enough for reserves to counterattack. That assumption failed. German panzer divisions, led by commanders who had refined combined arms doctrine, crossed the Ardennes with speed and coordination. They achieved tactical surprise at Sedan, broke the French line, and drove hard for the English Channel. Within days, armored spearheads severed the Allied forces in the north from their bases in the interior. The maneuver was misdirection paired with audacity. A feint into Belgium drew Allied attention while the decisive blow fell farther south. The result was encirclement. The British Expeditionary Force and major French formations were trapped near the port of Dunkirk, pressed against the sea. The evacuation that followed rescued large numbers of troops, but it did not repair the strategic defeat. Equipment was abandoned, units shattered, and initiative lost. France had been outmaneuvered in a campaign measured in weeks. The offensive then pivoted south. With their best formations captured or evacuated, the French struggled to form a coherent line. The methods used in Poland, air power to disrupt, armor to penetrate, mobile infantry to exploit, now tore through France. Resistance buckled. On June 22, 1940, barely 6 weeks after the offensive began, France signed an armistice with Germany. The army, long regarded as Europe's strongest, had been forced to yield. American newspapers carried banner headlines. Newsreels showed German columns on the Champs-Élysées. The Atlantic no longer felt like a guarantee. The fall of France sent a shock through American politics and public opinion. Polls recorded a shift. While most Americans still opposed direct entry into the war, support grew for measures to aid nations resisting aggression. The debate sharpened around a simple fact: modern warfare could reorder the balance of power before distant democracies could mobilize. This defeat altered strategic calculations in Washington. If Germany could dismantle a major European state with such speed, it could consolidate control of the continent's resources and industry. That prospect posed a long-term challenge to American security. The question was no longer whether events would reach the Western Hemisphere, but how to shape policies before they did. For the first time, many contemplated the United States facing a hostile Europe and an aggressive Japan simultaneously. Confidence that France and its allies would absorb the shock had evaporated. The calendar mattered. So did distance, and distance had shrunk. The phony war ended not only on the map, but in the American mind. Complacency gave way to urgency, and as one ally fell, the spotlight shifted to the last major European democracy still in the fight. With France defeated, Britain became the last major European democracy actively resisting Hitler. The German High Command anticipated a swift conclusion. Their plan, Operation Sea Lion, required air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940 as the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force. This was not a battle for territory, but for control of the skies, a prerequisite for invasion. American reporters stationed in London provided a direct window into the conflict. Journalists like Edward R. Murrow delivered nightly radio broadcasts describing the relentless German bombing campaign known as the Blitz. Their voices, crackling with static, brought the sounds of air raid sirens, anti-aircraft fire, and collapsing buildings into American living rooms. Murrow's signature opening, "This is London," became a symbol of resilience. These first-hand accounts transformed the war from a series of headlines into a human drama. Listeners heard exhaustion and defiance in the reporters' voices, creating an emotional connection to the British people's plight. The Royal Air Force's performance against a larger attacker captured American admiration. Pilots, many barely out of flight school, engaged the Luftwaffe in daily dogfights. The technological strengths of Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, paired with an integrated air defense system that included radar and a coordinated command and control network, allowed the RAF to inflict heavy losses and respond with precision. The courage of these pilots, celebrated as "the few" by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, resonated deeply in the United States. It was a narrative of individual heroism and disciplined systems beating brute force. President Roosevelt recognized the strategic necessity of keeping Britain in the fight. He began to push the boundaries of neutrality, searching for ways to provide material support. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement, finalized in September 1940, was a direct result of this effort. The deal exchanged 50 aging U.S. Navy destroyers from the First World War era for 99-year leases to establish American military bases on British territories in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the Caribbean. This transaction was a landmark moment. It marked the first concrete material step toward active American support for the Allies. Legally, Roosevelt framed it as a strengthening of national defense, citing the new bases as vital for protecting the Western Hemisphere. Politically, it was a bold move that tested the spirit, if not the letter, of the Neutrality Acts. Isolationists criticized it as an act of war, but public sentiment was shifting toward support for Britain. The image of Britain standing alone against Nazi tyranny reshaped American opinion. The relentless bombing of British cities, far from breaking morale, seemed to harden it. This defiance made a powerful impression. The question for many Americans evolved from whether Britain could survive to what would happen if it fell. A Germany in control of Western Europe presented a long-term challenge to American security and economic interests. The Battle of Britain reached its climax in September 1940. The Luftwaffe shifted its strategy from attacking airfields to mass bombing of London, a move intended to break civilian will. The change allowed the RAF to recover its strength. The failure to achieve air superiority forced Hitler to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The immediate threat of invasion receded. The outcome had a clear effect on American perception. It demonstrated that Germany could be stopped. British resistance offered a new narrative, possible Allied victory, given time and material support. That conclusion prepared the ground for a broader policy shift in Washington, where leaders now weighed how to supply a partner still in the fight. The next step would move beyond one deal. It would demand a framework to turn sympathy into sustained production and caution into capacity. Washington moved from improvisation to doctrine. The arsenal of democracy became policy. In a December 1940 fireside chat, President Franklin Roosevelt introduced a new concept to the American people. He declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. The nation would actively supply the Allies with the tools of war, transforming industrial capacity into a strategic weapon. Roosevelt framed the struggle as a defense of democratic ideals and American security, with factories as the first line of defense. Words were followed by legislation. The Lend-Lease Act, formally titled An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, went to Congress in January 1941. Its purpose was to remove the cash payment barrier that had constrained aid under neutrality rules. Britain's reserves were nearing exhaustion. Lend-Lease proposed that the United States could lend or lease arms and supplies to any country whose defense the President deemed vital to American security. The fight over Lend-Lease became the central political battle of early 1941. Isolationists mounted a fierce opposition. Senator Burton Wheeler denounced the proposal as a reckless extension of executive power and warned it would drag the country toward war. The America First Committee, with figures like Charles Lindbergh, argued the act was a blank check for open-ended involvement and a path to sending American soldiers abroad. They warned of financial strain and the abandonment of promises to stay out of foreign wars. Supporters, led by Roosevelt and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, argued that aiding those already fighting the Axis was the most effective way to keep American casualties low. They presented Lend-Lease as an instrument of national self-defense. Roosevelt's analogy was simple. If a neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him a garden hose to stop the flames from reaching your own. A Britain able to fight was a barrier that protected the United States. Even as Congress debated, industry began to turn. Major firms prepared to retool assembly lines for military contracts, anticipating demand. Automobile plants planned tank production. New facilities such as the Detroit Tank Arsenal were organized. Shipyards expanded for cargo and naval construction. Other manufacturers shifted from consumer goods to precision components. The broad conversion would be explored in depth later, but its direction was clear. Planning, contracts, and capacity were aligning with policy. Lend-Lease passed in March 1941 after 2 months of contentious debate. The votes reflected a divided nation, but delivered broad authority to the president to send weapons, food, and equipment to countries deemed vital to U.S. defense. The initial appropriation reached into the billions of dollars. Shipments began to move. Aircraft, rifles, trucks, foodstuffs, and raw materials. Paper decisions became material supply. The passage marked a decisive commitment. The United States had not declared war, but it had chosen to use its economy as a strategic instrument against the Axis. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" moved from rhetoric to operating principle. Contracts linked the assembly line to the front line. The machinery was vast and increasingly coordinated. Policy also demanded manpower. Industrial output would mean little without trained forces to operate, escort, and ultimately fight with what those factories produced. As material flowed outward, planners faced the inward task of building an army and preparing a navy and air force for what might come next. While committing the nation's industrial power to its allies through Lend-Lease, the Roosevelt administration simultaneously began the immense task of preparing its own military for potential conflict. This dual-track approach reflected a careful political calculation. Support those already fighting while building a credible American force. The centerpiece of this preparedness effort was the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This legislation marked a historic break with tradition, instituting the first peacetime draft in the nation's history. The act required men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register with local draft boards. Those selected would serve for 12 months of training, with a statutory limit that their service would be confined to the Western Hemisphere. The public justification was defensive preparedness, a necessary measure to guard the Americas. The registration process was a massive logistical undertaking involving thousands of local boards staffed by volunteers. It brought the reality of the distant war directly into every American community. The impact on the size of the U.S. Army was immediate and dramatic. In late 1940, the Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men, a small force by global standards. Within a year of the draft's implementation, that number expanded to well over 1 million. New recruits, often called selectees, reported to training camps across the country. They exchanged civilian clothes for uniforms and began learning the basics of soldiering. This rapid expansion transformed the Army from a constabulary force into a nascent mass military. The scale of this buildup, however, revealed significant problems. Large maneuvers in 1941, most notably in Louisiana and the Carolinas, exposed serious deficiencies in training, equipment, and command. The Louisiana maneuvers, involving hundreds of thousands of men, were designed to test readiness under field conditions. The results were sobering. Units became lost, communications broke down, and mock battles often descended into confusion. The exercises highlighted a critical lack of experience among officers and a shortage of modern weapons, particularly tanks and anti-tank guns. The Army was larger, but still green and unevenly equipped. President Roosevelt navigated this period with care. He publicly balanced the rhetoric of preparedness with repeated promises that these measures were purely defensive. He assured the American people that the goal was to deter aggression and that he was committed to keeping their sons out of foreign combat. This balancing act was necessary to maintain public and congressional support for the draft and the ongoing military expansion. Moving too far ahead of public opinion risked a political backlash that could cripple the entire effort. The fragility of this consensus became stark in the summer of 1941. The initial 1-year term of service for the first draftees was due to expire. With the international situation deteriorating, the War Department argued that demobilizing this newly trained force would be reckless. The administration asked Congress to extend the term of service. The debate was fierce and emotional. Isolationists argued that extending the draft broke a promise to the soldiers and their families. They framed it as a betrayal and a step toward war. The House of Representatives passed the extension by a razor-thin margin. The fact that the continuation of the military buildup hinged on a handful of votes demonstrated how divided the nation remained, even after the fall of France and the Battle of Britain. The debate laid bare the tension between the executive branch's assessment of the threat and the isolationist sentiment that still held sway in Congress and across parts of the public. The nation was building an army with urgency and reluctance. Training camps filled, doctrine evolved, and the learning curve remained steep. Beyond drill fields and maneuvers, another test waited where policy met risk, far from the camps, on the open ocean. The flow of Lend-Lease supplies across the Atlantic created a new front. German U-boats operating in wolf packs, targeted convoys carrying American-made tanks, aircraft, and raw materials to Britain. The Battle of the Atlantic became a logistical struggle to keep the sea lanes open. In response, the United States Navy began escorting these convoys part way across the ocean. American destroyers shepherded merchant ships to a designated mid-ocean meeting point, where British and Canadian escorts assumed the final, most dangerous leg. This policy stretched the definition of neutrality to its edge. The first major incident came on September 4, 1941. The American destroyer, USS Greer, en route to Iceland, received a report from a British patrol plane of a submerged German U-boat ahead. The Greer began tracking U-652 and relayed its position to the British aircraft, which dropped depth charges. The U-boat, assuming it was under coordinated attack, fired a torpedo at the American ship. The Greer evaded the torpedo and replied with depth charges. Both sides used anti-submarine weapons. Neither scored a hit. President Roosevelt addressed the nation about the Greer. He labeled the U-boat's action piracy, a deliberate attack on an American warship on the high seas. He did not emphasize that the Greer had been tracking the submarine and assisting British aircraft for hours. In his framing, it was an unprovoked assault. He used the incident to announce a new directive, a shoot-on-sight order for American naval and air forces operating in waters he deemed essential to Western Hemisphere defense. U.S. forces were now authorized to attack Axis warships encountered within these expanded zones. Escalation followed. On October 17th, the destroyer USS Kearney assisted a convoy under attack near Iceland. A U-boat penetrated the screen and struck Kearney with a torpedo on the starboard side. The blast tore through the engine room, killing 11 American sailors and injuring many others. The crew kept the ship afloat and brought her to port. These were the first American combat deaths of the Second World War, though the nation remained technically at peace. 2 weeks later, the USS Reuben James was lost. On October 31st, while escorting a convoy west of Iceland, a torpedo detonated her forward magazine. The destroyer broke in two and sank within minutes. Of roughly 160 aboard, only 45 survived. The death of 115 sailors reverberated through the Navy and the public. Reuben James was the first U.S. Navy ship sunk by enemy action in the conflict. An undeniable reality emerged. American sailors were dying in combat with Germany. The line between neutrality and belligerency blurred into legal language that did not match events at sea. For the destroyer crews in the North Atlantic, orders and contact reports defined a shooting war. Isolationists in Congress and the America First Committee denounced the escort policy as provocative. They argued that by guarding British convoys, the United States invited attack and edged toward formal war. They cited the Greer to show that American ships were not passive victims, but active participants. The debate narrowed to operational details, patrol zones, rules of engagement, and the president's authority to widen both. By late 1941, the Atlantic Fleet fought a de facto campaign while the country clung to a legal fiction. Material aid flowed, weapons fired, and casualties mounted. The machinery was already engaged. What remained was the political barrier at home and whether it could hold once events outran the language of neutrality. At home, one obstacle still governed decisions. The final barrier was political, not military. By late 1941, the United States was engaged in conflict without a formal declaration. Industrial output flowed to Britain and, after June, to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The Navy fought an undeclared campaign against German U-boats in the North Atlantic. Yet public opinion remained fractured. A significant and vocal minority, organized under banners like the America First Committee, continued to argue against intervention. They believed the nation could and should remain apart from the European war. President Franklin Roosevelt recognized this reality. He judged that a full national commitment, a unity of purpose, would likely require a direct and undeniable attack on American territory or vital interests. That attack came on the morning of December 7, 1941. A Japanese carrier task force launched a surprise strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The plan was methodical and the execution devastating. In 2 waves, Japanese aircraft targeted battleships, airfields, and support facilities. The element of surprise was total. The attack killed 403 Americans and wounded 178. Battleship Row was shattered. The USS Arizona exploded and sank, taking 1,127 sailors with it. The USS Oklahoma capsized. The fleet's battle line was crippled. Ambiguity vanished with the smoke. The surprise blow, delivered on a quiet Sunday while Japanese diplomats still met in Washington, ignited a wave of national unity. The question shifted instantly from whether to fight to how to win. A sense of betrayal, of diplomacy used as cover, drove a demand for retaliation and clarity of purpose. The political transformation followed at once. Isolationist organizations that had commanded large followings saw their influence dissolve. Within a week, the America First Committee disbanded. Its most visible spokesman, Charles Lindbergh, declared support for the war effort. A movement that had argued for distance could not survive a direct strike on American territory. Congress reflected the new unity. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session and called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. He requested a declaration of war against Japan. The response was overwhelming. The Senate voted 82-0. The House voted 388-1. The lone dissent came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a committed pacifist who had also opposed entry into the First World War. The votes showed that the barrier had been broken. Events widened the war within days. On December 11th, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States, aligning formally with Japan under the Tripartite Pact. The decision removed a strategic dilemma for Washington. It permitted a direct commitment to a 2-front war against the Japanese Empire and Nazi Germany without the need for additional legal maneuvers. Pearl Harbor altered more than policy. It changed assumptions. The protection, once attributed to 2 oceans, was exposed as an illusion in the age of carrier aviation and long-range strikes. The conflict was no longer distant reporting. It was a direct assault on American soil. The shock galvanized the nation's industrial, military, and human resources into a single effort. Debate gave way to mobilization. Planning, budgets, and production would now align with a wartime footing. The next phase would move from decisions to output, factories, shipyards, and laboratories, shifting at unprecedented speed to meet a global war's demands. Mobilizing the nation began as a coordinated command over resources, labor, and time. Decisions became schedules, priorities became quotas. The attack on Pearl Harbor triggered a rapid and comprehensive economic transformation. The nation's industrial machine, already building momentum through Lend-Lease, now accelerated. Factories that had produced consumer goods were retooled for military production under new federal direction, such as the War Production Board. Economic output narrowed to a single objective: victory. The scale had few precedents. Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union had oriented their economies toward war earlier, but the American effort leveraged vast natural resources, an undamaged industrial base, and a large workforce. That combination produced a surge in material that shifted the strategic balance. The claim was not boast, it was capacity meeting coordination. A pivotal signal came in February 1942 when automobile manufacturers ceased civilian car production. The last passenger model rolled off the line for the duration. Plants that had built Chevrolets and Fords were reconfigured to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant focused on B-24 Liberator bombers with a target of around 1 per hour as processes matured. Conversion was uneven, but momentum built. Shipbuilding formed another pillar. Yards on both coasts ran around the clock. The Liberty ship, standardized, prefabricated, and assembled with streamlined techniques, became the workhorse. Kaiser's Richmond, California yards reduced construction time dramatically, moving from months to weeks. These ships kept supply lines alive across the Atlantic and the Pacific. Aircraft production tested the limits of planning and throughput. By 1944, output reached heights unmatched by any single nation in the conflict. Firms like Boeing, Lockheed, and North American Aviation produced tens of thousands of bombers, fighters, and transports. Production supported U.S. forces and allies alike. Air power, fed by this pipeline, underwrote campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. Alongside the visible build-out, a secret enterprise grew. The Manhattan Project employed more than 100,000 workers, ultimately about $130,000 across sites, including Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. The effort cost roughly $2 billion. It demanded strict compartmentalization, industrial-scale science, and unusual speed. Most workers did not know the end use of the parts they produced. It was mobilization aimed at a single weapon. War needs reshaped daily life. The government instituted rationing for gasoline, tires, sugar, coffee, meat, and shoes. Coupon books regulated consumption to conserve resources and restrain inflation. Scrap drives in victory gardens became routine. The purpose was practical: move materials to the front first, and civic, giving households a defined role in the national effort. This mobilization changed strategy. Abundant equipment enabled sustained operations, replacements, and reserves. Where the Axis relied on early tactical advantage and limited production runs, the United States emphasized standardization, logistics, and volume. The machinery was vast and increasingly integrated with Allied planning. The industrial story fed directly into the human one. As production lines stabilized and convoys moved, new units formed, trained, and embarked. The next chapter unfolded not in boardrooms or shipyards, but among the men who carried this output into the field. From the ground level, the war looked different. The soldier's view began with arrival, adjustment, and hard lessons. The first American combat troops reached Britain in January 1942. These soldiers, part of what was termed the friendly invasion, were young, inexperienced, and largely untested. They stepped into a nation that had been at war for over 2 years. The Britain they encountered was marked by blackout curtains, food rationing, and the physical scars of the Blitz. For the British civilians and soldiers who greeted them, the Americans were a long-awaited reinforcement and a source of curiosity. The GIs seemed well-fed, confident, and equipped with material comforts that had become scarce. The initial period focused on intensive training. American units were stationed across the English countryside, adapting to European conditions. The training emphasized interoperability with Allied forces, particularly the British. Soldiers learned new procedures, familiarized themselves with different equipment, and conducted large-scale maneuvers. The goal was to forge a cohesive fighting force from raw draftees. Preparation was essential, but it remained theory until combat provided a verdict. That test came with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. This amphibious landing marked the first major American ground offensive against the Axis. The landings themselves were largely successful, but the subsequent campaign exposed weaknesses. When American forces advanced into Tunisia, they encountered veteran units of the German Afrika Korps. The result was a severe defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The engagement revealed critical deficiencies in American combat readiness. Green troops, led by inexperienced officers, were outmaneuvered by seasoned German commanders. Tactical dispositions were poor, unit cohesion broke under pressure, and inadequate anti-tank weapons left formations vulnerable to German armor. The defeat was brutal, but instructive. It forced swift changes in command and doctrine. Ineffective leaders were replaced, and training intensified to reflect the realities of fighting a skilled enemy. Survivors of the Tunisian campaign emerged with experience that would shape later operations in Sicily and Italy. They learned to respect the German soldiers' skill while building confidence in their own abilities and the potential of their equipment when properly employed. Kasserine became a turning point, accelerating the transformation of the American army from a novice force into a professional one. The American soldier brought a distinct approach to warfare, one that contrasted with European methods. The U.S. military emphasized technology, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. This doctrine reflected an industrial culture. The solution to a battlefield problem often came through production and material application, rather than relying primarily on small unit tactical brilliance. American plans leveraged artillery barrages, aerial bombardment, and the volume of supplies to break positions. This method required an immense logistical tail. For every frontline soldier, several others moved ammunition, food, fuel, and spare parts. The army advanced with its infrastructure, building airfields, pipelines, and depots as it went. Operations could be slower and more deliberate than German maneuvers, yet they were relentless and sustainable. An enemy might blunt an American attack, but another would follow, equally supplied, often better coordinated. As the war progressed, this combination of manpower and industrial method grew more effective. In the broad front advances that followed, the American way of war eroded the Wehrmacht's capacity to recover. The ability to replace losses in men and material quickly became a strategic advantage. The soldiers' view shifted from the confusion of early engagements to a disciplined, methodical confidence. What changed at the front mirrored the shift at home. Scale, coordination, and learning converged. By 1943, those converging forces began to influence the wider course of the conflict. Momentum shifted from survival to coordinated pressure. The turning tide was a process measured in factories, shipyards, and the weight of combined operations. By 1943, the balance moved toward the Allies, not through a single victory, but through sustained application of industrial and military force. Soviet endurance on the Eastern Front, British persistence in the Mediterranean and in the air, and American resources fused into a strategic vice. The Axis powers faced opponents who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. American involvement turned a coalition under stress into an offensive partnership. In Europe, the most visible American imprint was the strategic bombing campaign. The United States Army Air Forces pursued daylight precision bombing against key industrial targets, ball-bearing works, oil refineries, aircraft plants, while the RAF struck by night. Crews flew deep into defended airspace. Losses were heavy, driven by fighter interception and flak, but the campaign forced Germany to divert guns, aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots from field armies to homeland defense. Industrial disruption compounded those effects. Ground operations tightened that pressure. In Italy, the Allied invasion opened a new front that drew German divisions south even as the Eastern Front consumed men and material. Logistics, ports, rail, depots became targets as important as tanks. The machinery of German warfare began to seize under sustained strain. Across the Pacific, logistics dictated strategy. The United States executed a two-pronged advance. Admiral Chester Nimitz led the Central Pacific Drive, Gilbert's, Marshall's, Mariana's, supported by fast carrier task forces and an expanding amphibious fleet. General Douglas MacArthur advanced along New Guinea's northern coast toward the Philippines, using leapfrogging bases to cut Japanese supply lines. Shipyards produced carriers, destroyers, submarines and landing craft at a pace that kept both thrusts supplied. Japanese losses in ships, aircraft, and trained air crews could not be replaced, and the defensive perimeter contracted. Carrier warfare amplified this shift. Air groups launched from mobile decks struck airfields, shipping and infrastructure thousands of miles from the American mainland. Submarines, supplied and coordinated through a growing network of bases, targeted merchant shipping and oil routes, tightening a blockade that starved Japanese industry of fuel and raw materials. The culmination of Allied mass in the West came with D-Day on June 6, 1944. Operation Overlord was the largest amphibious invasion in history. More than 5,000 ships formed the Armada. Thousands of aircraft secured air superiority and attacked defenses. Months of build-up in British ports created a logistics bridge that pushed men, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel ashore faster than German reserves could be moved to the front. The landings were costly, but the scale ensured local reverses did not halt the wider advance. Once ashore, the flow of material made the difference. Sustaining a two-front global war defined the American contribution. Under the Europe First policy, the European theater received priority, yet the Pacific Fleet expanded into the most powerful naval force of the era. No other belligerent could keep two vast campaigns supplied at once. This capacity changed operational planning from what was possible to what could be supported continuously. It demonstrated that modern war would be decided by the ability to project and sustain power across oceans. Allied victory rested on more than battlefield performance. The Soviet Union bore the heaviest fighting against the Wehrmacht, but American trucks, food, and aircraft moved Red Army offensives faster and farther. Britain provided bases, convoys, and experience, while American production filled arsenals. Axis economies, bombed, blockaded, and outpaced, could not match the tempo. The turning tide was a process, not a single date, a sustained, coordinated pressure that left the Axis without a path to recovery. That pressure drew strength from an American society reorganized for war, where work shifts, shortages, and new roles reshaped daily life. The front lines began far from the battlefield, in neighborhoods, classrooms, and crowded plants that now served a single purpose. On the home front, transformation moved from policy to people. The home front transformation unfolded in factories, streets, and living rooms as the war reordered daily life. The most visible change was the entry of millions of women into the industrial workforce. With men conscripted into the military, defense plants faced a critical labor shortage. Women answered the call, taking jobs as welders, riveters, and machinists in aircraft factories and shipyards. The government-sponsored image of Rosie, the riveter, with her flexed arm and determined expression, became a powerful symbol of this shift. This mobilization challenged traditional gender roles and gave women a new sense of economic independence, though many would be pressured to leave their jobs when veterans returned. A second great migration transformed the nation's demographic landscape. African Americans moved from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West in search of defense jobs. This movement accelerated trends begun during the First World War, but on a much larger scale. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles offered higher wages and a chance to escape the Jim Crow South. This migration intensified racial tensions in overcrowded cities, leading to violent clashes like the 1943 Detroit race riot. The war created new opportunities while simultaneously exposing deep-seated social fractures. The federal government managed the domestic economy with an unprecedented level of control. The Office of Price Administration implemented a comprehensive system of rationing for essential goods like gasoline, tires, meat, and sugar. The goal was to curb inflation and ensure equitable distribution of scarce resources for the military. Citizens received coupon books that limited their purchases. Price controls sought to prevent profiteering and keep the cost of living manageable for working families. These measures required sacrifice, but were broadly accepted as necessary. War bonds became another mechanism for civilian participation. The government financed a substantial portion of the war through the sale of these bonds to the public. Through widespread advertising campaigns featuring movie stars and patriotic imagery, citizens were encouraged to invest their savings in the war. Buying a bond was framed as a direct contribution to victory. The program raised billions of dollars and helped control inflation by soaking up excess consumer purchasing power. It gave ordinary Americans a financial stake in the outcome of the conflict. Hollywood played a significant role in shaping public perception. Studios produced a mix of propaganda and popular entertainment that reinforced patriotic themes. Films depicted soldiers in combat, families enduring rationing and separation, and the crimes of the Axis powers. Even musicals and comedies included references to bond drives and shortages, integrating the war into the cultural narrative. Movie stars enlisted or toured the country selling bonds, blurring the line between celebrity and civic duty. The absence of millions of men created lasting social changes. Women managed households and farms alone. Children took on greater responsibilities. The experience of separation and independence for both those who served and those who stayed behind altered family dynamics and expectations. These shifts influenced social norms in the post-war period, contributing to demands for greater equality and changes in family life. Scientific and technological research accelerated under wartime pressure. The government poured resources into projects with military applications, leading to breakthroughs in radar, jet propulsion, antibiotics, and the atomic bomb. Collaboration between universities, industry, and the military established a model for post-war research and development. This investment laid groundwork for the technological advances that followed. America emerged from the war not simply victorious, but reshaped. The federal government had demonstrated its capacity to manage a command economy. Minorities gained footholds in industrial jobs. Women proved their capability in roles previously denied to them. The war ended the Great Depression and unlocked vast economic potential. The home front was integral to the war machine, and its transformation had strategic consequences. From these changes flowed new expectations about government, opportunity, and America's place in the world. Expectations that would frame the debate that followed. Out of that upheaval came a durable posture. The legacy of involvement defined how the United States would meet the world beyond 1945. The pre-war debate between isolationism and internationalism was settled by the experience of World War II. The idea that the nation could retreat behind ocean barriers and remain secure was discredited. Pearl Harbor proved that modern reach erased protective distance. The United States emerged not only as a victor, but as a dominant global power with responsibilities it would not easily abandon. Ceding leadership meant accepting outcomes shaped by others. A new consensus formed that active engagement was essential to national security. This role was quickly embedded in institutions. The United Nations, founded in 1945, aimed to prevent future conflicts through collective security. Its Security Council, with permanent members and veto power, reflected the distribution of power at war's end and the centrality of the United States. In parallel, the Bretton Woods system created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. American officials and economists helped design these bodies, and the dollar's strength anchored the framework. The objective was stability, rules, credit, and coordination to avoid the economic turmoil that had fueled extremism. At home, policy translated victory into opportunity. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, offered veterans tuition support, stipends, and access to low-cost mortgages. The results were structural. College enrollments surged, expanding an educated middle class. Home ownership spread through new subdivisions, catalyzing a housing boom and suburban growth. The law rewarded service and built capacity, directing public resources toward skills and assets rather than one-time payments. Wartime mobilization also shaped economic thought. The War Production Board's coordination of resources, contracts, and priorities demonstrated that large-scale planning could deliver outcomes markets alone would not achieve under extreme conditions. That lesson informed post-war policy debates. It did not create a command economy, but it normalized federal leadership in infrastructure, research, and strategic industries. The generation that fought carried a moral frame into public life. For many, the war was a necessary struggle against tyranny. That conviction underpinned early Cold War policy, containment, alliances, and the belief that American engagement could deter aggression and support the recovery of free societies. Leaders who had experienced mobilization and coalition warfare tended to see alliances as force multipliers and international commitments as instruments of security, not charity. A recognizable pattern. Initial reluctance could give way to rapid mobilization when core interests were threatened, as seen later in Korea and debated in Vietnam. The war showcased American capacity, industrial, logistical, and organizational, but also exposed the limits and costs of sustained global commitments. Speed in production and deployment created expectations for decisive action that were not always met in complex political conflicts. Tension persisted between national interest and international responsibility. The UN and Bretton Woods frameworks represented a rules-based order, yet US decisions were filtered through strategic calculations. Multilateralism and unilateral action lived side by side, with administrations weighing alliances, legal authorities, and operational timelines against perceived threats. World War II set the architecture of post-war policy. NATO formalized a transatlantic security guarantee. Permanent military readiness and global intelligence gathering became routine. The presidency's role in foreign affairs expanded, rooted in precedents established during the war. Isolationism as a governing stance ended. A sustained, if debated, global leadership began. The structures built then still guide American engagements and constraints. The path from caution to commitment reveals a larger arc. It shows how perceptions of danger, the organization of resources, and the use of power converged into a lasting stance. From that arc, one final perspective remains: how the journey from distance to leadership reframed the international order and the terms of American power. What endures is the pattern revealed by choices, capacities, and costs. Conclusion: the American journey from isolationism to global leadership transformed the international order. This shift began not with Pearl Harbor, but with the gradual recognition of a systemic threat tracked in hidden financing and the collapse of European democracy. Once mobilized, the machinery of democracy produced not only weapons, but a framework for security and recovery that reshaped the post-war world. Our mission is to examine these turning points with precision and care, and to surface the systems behind them. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.